The False Collar by Hans Christian Andersen, narrated by Carol Phillips. There was once a fine gentleman, all of whose movables were a boot-jack and a hair-comb, but he had the finest false collars in the world, and it is about one of these collars that we are now to hear a story. It was so old that it began to think of marriage, and it happened that it came to be washed in company with a garter. "Nay," said the collar, "I never did see anything so slender and so fine, so soft and so neat. May I not ask your name?" "That I shall not tell you," said the garter. "Where do you live?" asked the collar. But the garter was so bashful, so modest, and thought it was a strange question to answer. "You are certainly a girdle," said the collar, "that is to say, an inside girdle. I see well that you are both for use and ornament, my dear young lady." "I will thank you not to speak to me," said the garter. "I think I have not given the least occasion for it." "Yes, when one is as handsome as you," said the collar, "that is occasion enough." "Don't come so near me, I beg of you," said the garter. "You look so much like those men folks." "I am also a fine gentleman," said the collar. "I have a boot-jack and a hair-comb." But that was not true, for it was his master who had them. But he boasted. "Don't come so near me," said the garter. "I am not accustomed to it." "Prude!" exclaimed the collar, and then it was taken out of the washing tub. It was starched, hung over the back of a chair in the sunshine, and was then laid on the ironing blanket. Then came the warm box iron. "Dear lady," said the collar, "dear widow lady, I feel quite hot. I am quite changed. I begin to unfold myself. You will burn a hole in me. Oh, I offer you my hand." "Rag," said the box iron, and went proudly over the collar, for she fancied she was a steam engine that would go on the railroad and draw the wagons. "Rag," said the box iron. The collar was a little jagged at the edge, and so came the long scissors to cut off the jagged part. "Oh," said the collar, "you are certainly the first opera dancer. How well you can stretch your legs out! It is the most graceful performance I have ever seen. No one can imitate you." "I know it," said the scissors. "You deserve to be a baroness," said the collar. "All that I have is a fine gentleman, a boot-jack, and a hair-comb. If I only had the barony." "Do you seek my hand?" said the scissors, for she was angry. And without more ado, she cut him, and then he was condemned. "I shall now be obliged to ask the hair-comb. It is surprising how well you preserve your teeth, miss," said the collar. "Have you never thought of being betrothed?" "Yes, of course, you may be sure of that," said the hair-comb. "I am betrothed to the boot-jack." "Betrothed!" exclaimed the collar. Now there was no other to court, and so he despised it. A long time passed away. Then the collar came into the rag chest at the paper mill. There was a large company of rags, the fine by themselves and the coarse by themselves, just as it should be. They all had much to say, but the collar the most, for he was a real boaster. "I have had such an immense number of sweethearts," said the collar. "I could not be in peace. It is true, I was always a fine, starched-up gentleman. I had both a boot-jack and a hair-comb, which I never used. You should have seen me then. You should have seen me when I lay down. I shall never forget my first love. She was a girdle, so fine, so soft, and so charming. She threw herself into a tub of water for my sake. There was also a widow who became glowing hot, but I left her standing till she got black again. There was also the first opera dancer. She gave me that cut, which I now go with. She was so ferocious. My own hair comb was in love with me. She lost all her teeth from the heartache. Yes, I have lived to see much of that sort of thing, but I am extremely sorry for the the girdle, that went into the water tub. I have much on my conscience. I want to become white paper. And it became so. All the rags were turned into white paper. But the collar came to be just this very piece of white paper we here see, and on which the story is printed. And that was because it boasted so terribly afterwards of what had never happened to it. It would be well for us to beware that we may not act in a similar manner, for we can never know if we may not, in the course of time, also come into the rag chest and be made into white paper, and then have our whole life's history printed on it, even the most secret, and be obliged to run about and tell it ourselves, just like this collar. A biography of Hans Christian Andersen, narrated by Carol Phillips. Hans Christian Andersen, often referred to in Scandinavia as H.C. Andersen, born 2nd of April 1805, died 4th of August 1875, was a Danish author. Although a prolific writer of plays, travelogues, novels and poems, Andersen is best remembered for his fairy tales. Andersen's popularity is not limited to children. His stories, called eventyr in Danish, express themes that transcend age and nationality. Andersen's fairy tales, of which no less than 3,381 have been translated into more than 125 languages, have become culturally embedded in the West's collective consciousness, readily accessible to children, but presenting lessons of virtue and resilience in the face of adversity for mature readers as well. Some of his most famous fairy tales include The Emperor's New Clothes, The Little Mermaid, The Nightingale, The Snow Queen, The Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina, and many others. His stories have inspired ballets, plays, and animated and live-action films. One of Copenhagen's widest and busiest boulevard is labelled H.C. Andersen's Boulevard. Early work. A very early fairy tale by Andersen, The Tallow Candle, was discovered in a Danish archive in October 2012. The story, written in the 1820s, was about a candle that did not feel appreciated. It was written while Andersen was still in school and dedicated to a benefactor in whose family's possession it remained until it turned up among other family papers in a local archive. In 1829, Andersen enjoyed considerable success with the short story A Journey on Foot from Holman's Canal to the east point of Amager. Its protagonist meets characters ranging from St. Peter to a talking cat. Andersen followed this success with a theatrical piece, Love on St. Nicholas's Church Tower, and a short volume of poems. Although he made little progress writing and publishing immediately thereafter, in 1833 he received a small travel grant from the king, thus enabling him to set out on the first of many journeys through Europe. At Jura, near Le Locle in Switzerland, Andersen wrote the story Agnete and the Merman. He spent an evening in the Italian seaside village of Sestre Levante the same year, inspiring the title of The Bay of Fables. In October 1834, he arrived in Rome. Andersen's travels in Italy were to be reflected in his first novel, a fictionalized autobiography entitled The Improvisers, published in 1835 to instant acclaim. Fairy tales and poetry. Andersen's initial attempts at writing fairy tales were revisions of stories that he had heard as a child. Initially, his original fairy tales were not met with recognition, due partly to the difficulty of translating them. In 1835, Andersen published the first 2 installments of his fairy tales. More stories, completing the first volume, were published in 1837. The collection comprises 9 tales, including The Tinder Box, The Princess and the Pea, Thumbelina, The Little Mermaid, and The Emperor's New Clothes. The quality of these stories was not immediately recognised, and they sold poorly. At the same time, Andersen enjoyed more success with 2 novels, O.T., published 1836, and Only a Fiddler, published 1837. The latter work was reviewed by a young Søren Kierkegaard. After a visit to Sweden in 1837, Andersen became inspired by Scandinavism and committed himself to writing a poem that would convey the relatedness of Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. In July 1839, during a visit to the island of Funen, Andersen wrote the text of his poem Jeg en Skandinav, I am a Scandinavian, to capture, quote, the beauty of the Nordic spirit, the way the 3 sister nations have gradually grown together, end quote, as part of a Scandinavian national anthem. Composer Otto Lindblad set the poem to music, and the composition was published in January 1840. Its popularity peaked in 1845, after which it was seldom sung. Andersen returned to the fairy tale genre in 1838 with another collection, Fairy Tales Told for Children, new collection, first booklet, which consists of The Daisy, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, and The Wild Swans. 1845 saw a breakthrough for Andersen with the publication of 4 translations of his fairy tales. The Little Mermaid appeared in the periodical Bentley's Miscellany, followed by a second volume, Wonderful Stories for Children. 2 other volumes enthusiastically received were A Danish Storybook and Danish Fairy Tales and Legends. A review that appeared in the London journal The Athenaeum in February 1846 said of Wonderful Stories, "This is a book full of life and fancy, a book for grandfathers no less than grandchildren, not a word of which will be skipped by those who have it once in hand." Andersen would continue to write fairy tales and publish them in instalments until 1872.